On the 12th of February 2019, a subreddit called SimDemocracy was founded. Its founder, Gageboi, wanted to conduct a small democracy experiment. What would happen if a subreddit, a forum, governed itself? He set out the rules for how the subreddit would work. Every 2 weeks, the members of the subreddit would elect a president who would be appointed as the moderator. As the president, they could use their moderation powers as they saw fit. They could appoint low-ranked moderators to serve below them, they could write and enact whatever laws they wanted, and they could censor and ban from the subreddit whoever they wished. But there were also key limits on what the president couldn't do. They couldn't violate the Reddit terms of service, change the subreddit's description, or more importantly, interfere with the election of the next president. The job of running presidential elections was instead given to the subreddit supervisor, Gageboi, who, as the top moderator that outranked every elected official, had the power to appoint and dismiss moderators based on the results of the election. Being effectively an unelected head of state, Gageboi pledged to be a dormant supervisor, only doing what was necessary to keep the elections going, but otherwise leaving the subreddit to its own devices. It took just 48 hours for his democracy experiment to be plunged into its first crisis. In the first round of its first presidential election, a record 117 votes were cast, a number so high it represented a voter turnout of over 100%. Without clear rules on how elections should be run, Gageboi switched the voting method twice in that election, first to SurveyMonkey and then to Reddit, in order to frustrate further attempts to rig the election. In a close final round, ADCD was elected as the first president of SimDemocracy. But as quickly as he entered into office, another problem began to emerge. The rules outlining how the subreddit should be run, which had effectively become the subreddit's constitution at this point, were really unclear and sparsely written. For example, Section 4 of the Constitution stated that the president was prohibited from changing the subreddit's description, but that the rules page and sidebar are fair game. This implied that the president could, by changing the rules page for the subreddit, write and enact new legislation. Proceeding on this basis, ADCD passed legislation creating the Senate, delegating his lawmaking powers to this newly elected body of 5 senators, and tasked his vice president to run its inaugural election. Candidacies were made and ballots were cast, but on the day when the results of the election were expected to be announced, Vice President Mobile came in with a different announcement. Gageboi had messaged him, saying that the elections were undemocratic, but hadn't given further details yet. As a result, Gageboi had chosen to unverify the results of the election, and thus the Senate's election had been blocked. Upon hearing Mobile's announcement, Senate candidate Dovhikian reacted with anger. Sure, there was controversy over how the election was held, but unlike the presidency, which was regulated by the Constitution, the Senate was an executive-created body, whose rules, including its election, were regulated entirely by executive-created law. Nothing about the Senate's creation or election was unconstitutional. It didn't violate Reddit's rules, it didn't unban subreddit spammers, and it didn't interfere with presidential elections. If there was a controversy surrounding the Senate's election, only the president had the power to ameliorate that through legislation. So, under what authority did Gageboi claim to unverify the results? Gageboi quickly backtracked. He conceded he couldn't stop the Senate's formation from going ahead, but he also made it clear that he would highly disapprove of it. Without wanting to go against the supervisor's wishes, the vice president delayed the Senate's formation. They'll sort out Gageboi's concerns first. By 3 weeks into the experiment, Gageboi had resigned from his position as the subreddit supervisor. In his speech, he recognized that his position had become untenable. He frequently clashed with elected officials over his perceived political activism, he censored posts made by other users, and he felt overwhelmed by the myriad of duties he had to tend to. Without any consultation, he declared he was anointing his successor, Jackie, to take over the reins of being the subreddit supervisor. But as quickly as Gageboi handed in his resignation, suspicions began to swirl that Jackie was, in fact, Gageboi's alt account. Jackie was an entirely new account, supposedly because she was new to Reddit, with no pre-existing Reddit or Discord history. Wishing to preempt any potential issues with this new supervisor in the future, the Senate passed the Defense Against Tyranny Act, DATA, a law that would allow the Senate and the people to impeach the supervisor with a 3/4 majority vote. If the supervisor interfered with the impeachment process, such as deleting Senate votes or rigging the ratification referendum, they would be automatically impeached. Section 3 made the consequences of impeachment loud and clear. A. If the referendum passes, then the supervisor is asked to step down, and is expected to do so gracefully. B. If the supervisor refuses to step down, they are declared a tyrant, and when tyranny becomes law, rebellion becomes duty. All laws against rebellion or treason become null and void, and the supervisor is to be overthrown at all costs. But while Gageboi struggled to be a dormant supervisor, Jackie was a little too dormant. Her first job was to hold the next presidential elections, but the date for those, 14th of March 2019, came and went without a response. 4 days later, without any indication of where she was or whether she was even alive, Senator Mobil issued a threat. If Jackie didn't open up registrations for the next election soon, he would initiate impeachment proceedings. 1 week later, Jackie returned with an official apology, stating that she didn't check the subreddit because she thought everything was running smoothly without her. At this point, the Senate had given up entirely on Jackie and passed legislation creating a Secretary of Elections to hold presidential elections without the need for a supervisor. As the Senate was doing fine anyway, according to her, she announced her intention to continue being inactive. The only thing she'd do as supervisor was to unilaterally change the law so that all election results run by the Secretary of Elections had to be sent to her so she could personally verify their legitimacy. For the infuriated Senate, this was the final straw, and amidst a torrent of calls by their constituents demanding her resignation, Senator Mobil tabled a motion on the Senate floor, articles of impeachment against Supervisor Jackie. It voted unanimously in favour of the motion. 48 hours later, the results of the referendum were announced. 40 votes in favour, 4 votes against. With that, resignation was no longer a request, it was a demand of the law. If Jackie refused to resign as supervisor, she would be declared a tyrant by the Senate, and when tyranny becomes law, rebellion becomes duty. 3 days prior, a user had asked Jackie whether she would step down as supervisor once her replacement was named. Firing the first salvo of the Civil War, she responded, "I don't think so." SimDemocracy's story sits atop tens of thousands of other stories told about democracy experiments set up and run by teenagers. Across a myriad of games, such as Minecraft, Habbo, and Nation States, and a myriad of platforms, such as Discord, Reddit, and old-style forums, teenagers have pursued the goal of running their own virtual democracies to mixed success. This video can't cover all of their stories, obviously, but what it can do is provide an overview of the life cycle of teenage-run virtual democracies. Teenagers create virtual democracies for a variety of reasons. Some create them as experiments out of sheer curiosity, with founders wondering what would happen if Reddit or Discord users were to elect their own moderators. Others create them to chase a more aspirational vision of player-led governance, like the Minecraft server Democracy Craft, which was created after a co-founder had an epiphany following his experiences with city roleplay server owners who were resistant to change. As the story of SimDemocracy shows, whatever their motivations, founders play a crucial role in shaping a virtual democracy's destiny. A founder with less than benevolent intentions can strangle democratic aspirations dead on arrival. But why do founders have such an outsized impact on a democracy's future? The answer is that they possess the power of a god. Let me explain. Let's suppose that a person wanted to create a virtual democracy on a Discord server. Every month, members of the server would be able to elect a president who would be given moderator permissions. Someone has to be the owner of that server, the person who actually gives the elected president their powers. That owner has the technical power to do virtually anything on the server. They could censor any post they disliked, ban any person they wished, or point or dismiss any person to any position of power. And importantly, there are virtually no technical constraints on that power. A Discord president could insist that they were exercising their veto over and over again, but that doesn't stop the reality that a frustrated owner could delete the Discord server entirely. So how do you actually enforce a constitution? How do you ensure that a democratic system is able to outlive its founder or owner? The answer, in theory, is to build democratic resilience. Back to our Discord example, a virtual democracy could assign one or several people to maintain a backup Discord server. Archives containing legislation, court decisions, and government documents could be copied both by officially designated archivists but also other ordinary users. Political parties, news organisations, and NGOs can run their own Discord servers or other platforms, like subreddits, to disseminate information outside of the owner's control. What you end up with is a system that is resilient to the caprice of a single owner. If they delete the server or commit a coup d'etat, users would simply revolt against them and move to a different server like nothing ever happened. But just because you can make an owner bend to the will of the people doesn't mean you always should. There are cases to be made that owners sometimes have to make unpopular and undemocratic decisions. The owner of a democratically run Minecraft server, for example, may have to veto laws passed by its users if the cost of implementing it would quintuple the server's day-to-day running costs. The owner of a Discord democracy may have to, and should, take the drastic step of deposing an elected president if they pass an executive order titled the Nuremberg Order, forcing all Jewish players to display a Star of David next to their usernames. The struggle to build a constitution that balances the godlike powers of owners with democratically run institutions has led to the collapse of many virtual democracies before they've even gotten off the ground. To understand just how difficult this task is, let's go back to our Discord democracy example. If your primary concern is about the very existence of an unelected owner, and you believed that owners should be accountable to the people at all times, what you could do is design a constitution requiring that server ownership be transferred to whoever is elected the head of government. In practice, this is basically never done, and it's not hard to see why. You could have a democratically resilient system making any coup d'etat attempt by an owner president futile, but that's not going to stop the existence of 15-year-old politicians who absolutely will try doing it anyway. In order to prevent every presidential election from turning into a game of Russian roulette, you could try a completely different model where you minimize the number of times you transfer server ownership. Under the dual state, the owner is kept entirely separate from the democratic process. The owner is given specific responsibilities like paying server running costs and enforcing out-of-character rules, but importantly is also given the ability to override the democratic process to carry out those responsibilities. The only thing stopping the owner from turning the place into a dictatorship wouldn't be the law, but instead the threat of revolution, which hangs as the sword of Damocles. The issue with this approach is that revolution is a nuclear option. It only works when a large group of players agree that the wrongs committed warrant such a response. But owners can make incredibly controversial decisions that divide the population, and under the dual state, there is no appeal. Thus, for the dual state to sustainably work, you need an owner that a lot of players will be satisfied with, someone who has both the benevolent intentions to make democracy work and the competence to know when they should or shouldn't intervene. The fact that there is an entire term coined by the community to describe a lack of owner self-restraint, adminocracy, suggests that benevolence and competence in owners may be hard to come by. So many virtual democracies end up going for a middle option, giving owners a degree of independence from democratic institutions, but not too much. For example, the actions of owners could be subject to judicial review by a court. This option is not without its faults though. As will be made evident later in the video, a poorly designed system of checks and balances can dangerously obstruct the enforcement of out-of-character rules. Resolving the power struggle between the owner and democratic institutions is just one out of the many things that need to be done when drafting a constitution. Teenage politicians can spend hours, days, and weeks wrangling over a constitution's text line by line, because even a single word can change the course of history. When Gageboi ascended to the presidency on the 6th of March 2024 in the Minecraft server Democracy Craft, he gave his political party, the Redmont Reform Coalition (RRC), and his political allies, the Redmont Nationalist Party (RNP), what they had always dreamed of: the coveted trifecta. The governing coalition controlled a supermajority in both the House and Senate, and with 2 vacancies in the Supreme Court, they were on track to take control of that as well. In the last election, the centre-right RRC ran on a platform of tax reform, pledging to reduce taxes that were, according to them, robbing the average citizen a comfortable living. The RRC would provide tax relief for charities, strike public-private partnerships to create new job opportunities, but also support a capital gains tax to ensure, in their words, that the wealthiest in society are paying their fair share. Their coalition partner, the RNP, was markedly more conservative. They ran on a platform of austerity, vowing to make huge cuts to government spending by scrapping Medicare for all and cracking down on benefit claimants. Whatever their ideological differences, which they could always hammer out behind closed doors, one thing was for certain. With what they saw as an obstructionist opposition hell-bent on stopping them finally out of power, the governing coalition now had a free hand to shape Democracy Craft's politics for a generation. According to official government statistics, Gageboi ascended to the presidency with an approval rating of 18%. The leader of the RNP, House Representative Crix, who had survived an attempt initiated by his constituents to recall him just a week earlier, had approval ratings hovering at 9%. In contrast, Gageboi's predecessor, the opposition Gold-Blooded, whom they had just ousted from the presidency, left the office with an 80% approval rating. If the opinion polls didn't give a clear enough indication of public sentiment, the fuming press certainly did. The Associated Press, not the real one, called the removal of the former president an attack on democracy. The editorial board for Politico, not the real one, wrote that Representative Crix wouldn't know what democracy was even if it tripped over him. The Labour Times described the collective feeling as sickness for the corrupted times they were living in, excoriating Crix for making moves with his little minions in Congress to put his well-known puppet into the presidency. The coalition had just pulled off one of the most spectacular legal coups in Democracy Craft's history, and to understand how they did it, we have to rewind back 20 days to the 15th of February 2024. The opposition figure Gold-Blooded had just won the presidential election. A former member of the RNP, Gold-Blooded had since become one of the party's main arch-rivals, following a protracted political dispute in the last presidential administration. The coalition at this point controlled both houses of Congress, following a highly coordinated and disciplined political campaign, which involved aggressively canvassing voters on the Minecraft server and sending direct messages to practically every voter on the Discord. The coalition swept into power with 7 out of 11 seats in the House of Representatives and 4 out of 6 seats in the Senate. Under the Constitution, all of the president's cabinet picks had to be approved by the Senate, and with a Senate dominated by his political rivals, it was going to be an uphill battle. But Gold-Blooded still had a card up his sleeve. Until the Senate actually voted on his appointments, his cabinet picks could begin taking up their posts right away as acting secretaries. When Gold-Blooded finally unveiled his interim cabinet, one of his appointments caught the attention of the coalition's leadership team. The health secretary was a member of the opposition in the House of Representatives. As the Constitution forbade secretaries from serving in Congress, the health secretary had to resign from the legislature, leaving a vacancy in the House of Representatives. Section 3 of the Electoral Amendment Act specifies what happens when a seat in Congress becomes vacant. As what happens next hinges on the specific wording of the law, it's worth reading out the section in full. Where a seat in a chamber becomes vacant, the relevant presiding officer, i.e. the Speaker of the House, is obligated to do the following. A. Nominate the next winning candidate according to the electoral system used in the election. For the nominee to assume office, they must attain a majority approval in both chambers. B. Congress must vote on a nomination within 4 days of the seat becoming vacant. A special election will be automatically triggered where there are no suitable candidates in the most recent election, 4 days has elapsed and the vacancy has not been filled, or a special election has been successfully motioned. One way of interpreting this section, and the way I, as a lawyer, assumed the author intended the section to be read, is that when a vacancy arises in the House of Representatives, the Speaker refers to a list of candidates who ran in the last election, sorted by the numbers of votes they received. The candidate that got the most votes but didn't win gets nominated by the Speaker. If the candidate is approved by a majority vote in both the House and Senate, they fill that vacant seat, but if either chamber rejects that candidate, a special election automatically takes place. A special election also takes place if there were no candidates the Speaker could nominate in the first place, if the 4-day deadline passed without a nomination being done in time, or if the House voted in favour of holding a special election. However, the coalition's leadership had a different interpretation. According to them, Section 3b stated that Congress must vote on a nomination, not that Congress must vote on the nomination. While the Speaker was legally required to nominate the next winning candidate to fill the vacancy, the coalition argued that a different representative could nominate someone else entirely to fill that vacant seat. Section 3b stated that a special election was automatically triggered if there are no suitable candidates in the most recent election, but they argued that the section never actually specified that the suitable candidate actually had to be chosen. To put it another way, if the House voted to reject the Speaker's nomination, they argued that a special election would not automatically be triggered because a suitable candidate still technically exists. It's just that they didn't choose the suitable candidate, which they argued the legislation didn't require them to do in the first place. Before anyone had time to object to this reasoning, the coalition rushed through the appointment of an RRC backbencher at breakneck speed. With his appointment, the coalition now controlled 8 out of 11 seats in the House of Representatives. 8 is a critical number because it gave the coalition the unilateral ability to invoke Section 12(1) of the Electoral Act. If a representative is no longer fit for office, they can be removed from Congress early by the relevant presiding officer, i.e. Speaker of the House, with the consent of 4/5 of their chamber, excluding the individual in question. As a representative couldn't vote on their own removal, the coalition had 8 out of 10 lawmakers who could vote to remove any member of the opposition in the House, meeting the 4/5 threshold required by law. But the ability to decant the entire House of Representatives of opposition lawmakers wasn't even their most important power. By controlling 4 out of 6 senators, which eventually turned to 4 out of 5 after an opposition senator was successfully ousted, the coalition also possessed a 2/3 supermajority in the Senate. Under the Constitution, the impeachment of any public official, such as a judge, a Supreme Court justice, or even the president, required a 2/3 vote in the House of Representatives, followed by a 2/3 vote in the Senate. With just one cabinet appointment, the president had just given the coalition the keys to systematically purge the opposition from every branch of government. The coalition didn't wait to wield their newly gained powers. Almost immediately, Cricks tabled a motion to impeach a judge, swiftly followed by another motion to impeach a justice of the Supreme Court. Watching the rule of law collapse beneath their feet, the Supreme Court justices didn't wait. One justice handed in their resignation, followed by the Chief Justice the very next day. In one fell swoop, the Supreme Court was reduced to a single justice, rendered utterly powerless as it no longer possessed the quorum to rule on any case. With the courts no longer an obstacle to achieving their political goals, the coalition was now able to do what they always wanted to do. 2 motions were tabled on the floor of the House: articles of impeachment against Vice President Sumhuman and articles of impeachment against President Cold-Blooded. The impeachment charges were a complete sham. For example, after whipping coalition senators to systematically veto his cabinet appointments, the House charged the president with violating his constitutional duty to build a working cabinet, leaving the nation broken. But it didn't matter. The coalition had the numbers. The president and vice president were guilty the moment the charges were announced, and their removal would be swift and guaranteed. The opposition attempted to mount a comeback. A recall petition was filed against Representative Cricks, and it quickly gained enough signatures to force a referendum on his recall. If they could remove Cricks from the House of Representatives, they could reduce the coalition back to 7 seats, removing their supermajority, and in turn, removing their power of impeachment. With bated breath, the public waited for the announcement of the referendum results. The vote wasn't even close. 52 votes in favour of recall, 13 votes against. 80% of voters said they wanted him out. With that, the recall of Representative Cricks failed, as it didn't meet the 91% threshold required by law. The sole Supreme Court Justice, Matthew, wasn't going to just sit idly by. Finding his own loophole in the Constitution, he claimed to appoint an acting Supreme Court Justice to serve as his colleague, giving the court the necessary quorum to continue functioning. With the Supreme Court back in business, it quickly rushed to the President's aid by issuing an emergency court order to stop the Senate from voting on the impeachments of the President and Vice President. In response, a defiant Gageboi, Speaker of the House, gave his speech. In the aftermath of Justice Matthew's erratic announcement, where he declared his intent to stack the court by appointing someone without lawful authority, I initially chose to withhold comment on the matter. I considered the possibility that such an action was a result of a momentary lapse into madness or some undue influence. I'd hoped the courts would return to a state of sanity, but it has become clear that this will not happen. The initiation of these impeachment proceedings is driven by a singular purpose: to restore the sanctity of democracy. These events reveal the corruption within the executive and the judiciary, now laid bare for all to see. Acting Chief Justice Matthew has effectively taken our government hostage, and the Department of Legal Affairs remains inactive, unwilling to go against a corrupt president and vice president out of a fear of retribution or as an act of collusion. We refuse to recognise the authority of this pretender Supreme Court. We reject the legitimacy of its rulings. Impeachment proceedings against Justice Matthew and Judge Relaxed will commence shortly, and we will prosecute them on charges of treason, government impersonation, fraud, and all other manner of charges. God bless democracy, and God bless democracy craft. The President of the Senate began reading out the impeachment charges levelled against the Vice President. The Senate rendered their verdict: guilty, 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 guilty. Then they moved on to the President. For violating the Constitution with his interim cabinet appointment, they found him guilty. Their convictions were to be punished by the highest penalty the Constitution could ascribe: removal from their offices effective immediately. As there was no Vice President available to take over the presidency, under the Constitution, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Gageboi, became the new President of Democracy Craft. The story of the coalition's takeover of Democracy Craft is a textbook case of democratic backsliding. Stories like this are the reason why teenage politicians and lawyers wrangle over every little detail of a constitution during its life cycle, either to protect and safeguard it, or to break and destroy it. This video can't go through every possible way that a constitution written by a bunch of teenagers can be broken, because that topic alone could encompass an entire documentary in its own right. So, instead, we'll focus on one. In response to a perpetual fear of government overreach, either by the owners or by elected governments, many constitutions feature a Bill of Rights, a source of constitutional rights and constitutional wrongs.
Blue the Giant Rule, your activity in Parliament has been rather questionable. I would like to bring up the time that you told Baymax 1020 to F off in Parliament and only withdrew that statement being made, albeit rather reluctantly. Can your party continue to represent people respectfully in Parliament? And your party has continuously brought up the concept of like freedom of speech or expression in Parliament. Is everything really about freedom of speech or freedom of expression, or is it just exaggeration on your party's end?
Well, I mean, here's the thing. I feel like that's such an angled question to be asking, because the thing is, if you think about it, I mean, if we're not safeguarding free speech and free expression, then we're not safeguarding democracy. And if we're not safeguarding democracy, then what you're saying is essentially the system is a sham. It's a fake, and it's not actually a proper system. So, what do you mean? Like, I don't understand. Like, how
I
you could.
think generally quite a lot of people are getting a bit tired with the freedom of speech or freedom of expression rhetoric that your party seems to be putting out a lot. So would you like to respond to that?
Well, here's the thing. The truth is, it's when you get it's when you take your rights for granted, and it's where you no longer care about your rights, that your rights are just going to be taken away. So if you don't care about your rights, then somebody's going to abuse that, and then you're no longer going to have your rights anymore.
Constitutional rights are often invoked by teenage politicians, lawyers, and citizens to advance their own political interests. Many virtual democracies have an entrenched Bill of Rights to protect freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and the right to a fair trial.
It's true that there should be freedom of speech, but there are ways and other ways to say things. For example, I like to report another episode of use accusing all architects of the server of being, quote, is this a proper parliamentary procedure in your opinion?
Here's the thing you need to realize. Does it matter? Does it actually matter? Like what you're saying right now is, like, if I've
No,
got it.
it matters because we cannot have a prime minister that tells the members of the chamber to kindly fuck off and insults people. That not makes sense if you ask me.
Well, things change. Have you ever thought about that?
Often, the courts will be given the task of safeguarding these rights, with the power to strike down legislation and government actions for being unconstitutional. As a result, the battle for rights often happens in virtual courtrooms, with teenagers fashioning themselves as silks launching a deluge of judicial reviews to boldly protect the rights of their clients to sometimes problematic results. That said, the debate over constitutional rights aren't always confined to the courts.
I want to have an answer for this because it's really important for a ruling party having to know how to behave in the parliament.
Well, yes, but
You would have got mad.
at the same
The thing is, you would have got mad if anyone told you to shut the fuck up, yet like you did to Baymax 11020. It's a real state of fact. You would have say, "Oh no, you are removing me from my possibility to have freedom of speech."
well, you know what? Should I start accusing everyone else of bad things they did in the past? Should I just list mistakes people make in the past and just fixate on that?
As was previously hinted at, one of the most contentious and often fought over rights is freedom of speech. What exactly is it, and to what extent does it apply?
Why are we using such a metric to scapegoat? We're using such a metric to silence me. You're using it to silence me. You're using it to make my opinion relevant.
No. We are not. Nobody is trying to silence you at all.
In September 2020, the Congress of the Discord-based US government simulator, We the People, passed a law called the Anti-Spam Act, which made spamming and mass pinging on the Discord server a criminal offence. It defines spamming as posting a string of text, emojis, or otherwise at least 5 times in the span of 5 minutes, and mass pinging as pinging either an individual or role 5 times or more within the span of 10 minutes. If a user broke the law, they would be given a fine of in-game dollars and thrown into a Discord jail. When the law was challenged on the basis that it violated the constitutional right to freedom of speech, the Chief Justice handed down their judgment. When Congress enacted the Anti-Spam Act, it criminalised what it saw as unwanted speech that, in its eyes, was destructive or disruptive. The court can in no way endorse such a regime. It has never endorsed the Orwellian notion that the government may decide that speech, which it may see as purposefully disrupting, be banned. The government may not punish speech which does not correspond to their liking, or is simply disruptive to another person. The government's position that it can paves the way for widespread censorship of dissenting views. For the foregoing reasons, the court finds that the Anti-Spam Act, as applied, abridges the freedom of the people to speak. With that, a law which prohibited spamming and mass pinging on the Discord server was struck down and declared unconstitutional. Other laws, in particular laws prohibiting hate speech, are also often challenged on the basis of freedom of speech. It's a legal challenge that has become so common that some constitutions are drafted explicitly to exclude hate speech as a form of protected speech. The fact that there are multiple landmark Supreme Court cases on whether users have the legal right to say the N-word pretty much sums up the state of public interest litigation in this field. The struggle over regulating hate speech also reveals another problem: the clash between constitutional rights and a platform's terms of service. For example, the Discord community guidelines have a very broad prohibition on hate speech, and servers that systematically violate this prohibition are threatened with deletion. Thus, some democracies have justified their prohibition on hate speech on the basis that allowing it would be a literal threat to national security. If the government allowed users to spam racial slurs on the Discord server with impunity, the very existence of the state would be under threat. But perhaps the most problematic clash between constitutional rights and the terms of service is the right to a fair trial. Suppose you had a case involving a player who solicited explicit photos from another player who is a minor. How exactly are you meant to give them a fair trial? The question isn't hypothetical, by the way. In March 2020, the Habbo White House had to deal with this exact issue when allegations arose that a former president, who was 21 at the time, solicited explicit photos from another player who was 16 at the time, an allegation the former president reportedly denied in a strongly worded statement. At this point, the Habbo White House had been rocked by several such scandals. Previously, civil servants were accused of soliciting and disseminating explicit images of minors, stalking, and even finding out the real-world name and addresses of a fellow employee. Prosecutors who were assigned to deal with these cases quickly found themselves stuck in a Kafkaesque nightmare, as the system they built to zealously safeguard constitutional rights ended up throwing every procedural hurdle you could possibly think of. The first hurdle that prosecutors had to jump over was working out what crime they could even charge the accused with in the first place. Back then, the criminal code had 0 crimes related to sexual offences. Most of the offences listed under the Crimes Act were related to employment, such as the crime of double jobbing, which is when a player simultaneously takes up employment in both the Habbo White House and a different Habbo corporation. Prosecutors, therefore, either had to shoehorn their charges into existing crimes like bullying, harassment, or corruption, or come up with some other crime that they could argue was derived from common law. The second hurdle prosecutors had to face was the question of jurisdiction. Under the Legislation Act, the laws of the Habbo White House only extended to its website, its official documents, and the game of Habbo itself. What this meant was that before 2019, if a crime happened literally anywhere else, like Snapchat, Kik or Discord, prosecutors had no jurisdiction to even pursue the case. After a working group was set up to reform the law in 2019, the Legislation Act was amended to allow prosecutors to pursue crimes if they were related to the White House, so long as specific requirements were met. Those specific requirements, the rules of evidence, were the prosecutor's third hurdle. Under the Prosecution Act, only certain forms of evidence could be admitted in court. For evidence to be admissible, they had to contain the URL, date, and time. Screenshots of Habbo must include the room information box, including details of the room's name and owner. Screenshots of the Habbo White House website must include a username in the top right corner of the page, and screenshots of official documents must include the title of the document. The Attorney General may, at their sole discretion, choose to redact the name of the person who captured the evidence. But for the evidence to be admissible, absolutely nothing else could be redacted. It didn't matter if the evidence contained the personal details of the alleged victim or unrelated third parties, or worse still, contained extremely graphic images. If anything else was redacted, the evidence was inadmissible in court. If, nevertheless, prosecutors wished to use any evidence that didn't meet the Prosecution Act's admissibility requirements, for example, Discord screenshots, prosecutors had to get their evidence certified by a statutory ethics board. The ethics board was a jury of 7 people, composed of 5 randomly chosen players who were impartial and unbiased, along with the Attorney General and President as permanent members. Prosecutors sent copies of their evidence to the ethics board, who were given 3 days to review the evidence. By a majority vote, the ethics board can either choose to allow the evidence in a criminal trial or forbid it. The decision of the ethics board was final. There was no recourse for appealing its decisions, such as judicial review. When prosecutors finally built up a criminal case to charge the accused with, they had to jump over their 4th hurdle, the pre-trial. Prosecutors had to issue a formal indictment listing the criminal charges they were pressing, all of the evidence they intended to use, and all of the witnesses they planned to call. The indictment had to be issued within 2 months of the alleged crime, because there was also a 2-month statute of limitations for all crimes under the Prosecution Act. After the indictment was issued, the Department of Justice then had to assign the defendant an attorney to begin settlement talks. The law required that all parties to a criminal case had to make an attempt to settle out of court, and as the Prosecution Act makes clear, there were no limitations to what can be offered and accepted in a settlement hearing. If no settlement was reached, the Department of Justice then had to schedule a criminal trial for a time when all parties, the prosecutor, the witnesses, the judges, the defendant, and the defense attorney were all available. When that happened, prosecutors had to jump through their 5th hurdle, the actual trial. A panel of 5 to 9 Supreme Court justices were assembled to hear the trial, reviewing the evidence from both the prosecution and the defense. Afterwards, the Supreme Court handed down its verdict, guilty or not guilty, before finally issuing a punishment they deemed to be appropriate, including a ban from the Habbo White House. By the end of this process, a case involving a player soliciting explicit images from a minor could have its private evidence and submissions seen by 20 other teenage players. According to one source familiar with these prosecutions, some of these players had, quote, demonstrated worrying ignorance regarding aspects like the age of consent. If, after all of that, the Supreme Court found the accused not guilty of the crime they were charged with, prosecutors were barred from charging them again, owing to the rule against double jeopardy. But even if they were found guilty, prosecutors had to jump through a 6th and final hurdle, convincing the president, both current and future, not to pardon the defendant, which would immediately exonerate them of the crime they were just convicted of. It shouldn't be surprising to learn that, in practice, prosecutors simply gave up trying. The obsession over preserving due process in the justice system created a culture, in the words of one source, institutionalized indifference. As the Habbo White House failed to effectively deal with allegations of sexual offences, they were reduced to being mere factoids, common knowledge that simply floated around the community, placing the burden on victims to avoid interactions with their alleged abusers. Leaders of specific government branches reportedly took matters into their own hands by creating hiring blacklists to prevent alleged offenders from joining their specific departments. But these blacklists were a patchwork response, and the alleged offenders could always seek judicial review to overturn their prescription. In the end, the accused former president wasn't even banned under the criminal justice system. Instead, prosecutors used a legal loophole. The Habbo White House at the time had an extradition treaty with a different Habbo organisation. By lobbying them to issue what was effectively an international arrest warrant against the former president, prosecutors were able to ban him on the grounds of complying with their obligations under international law. The Habbo White House would eventually undergo a significant overhaul in how it dealt with these cases. In mid-2020, the Safety and Anonymity for Everyone Act, or SAFE Act, passed with an overwhelming majority, introducing a zero-tolerance approach for specific out-of-character offences. These one-punishment crimes, as they were called, were punishable by a mandatory permanent ban. A new legal duty was introduced to ensure that evidence was dealt with discreetly to ensure the protection of the victim at all times, and sweeping constitutional reforms were enacted to replace the old ethics board system with a streamlined process of allowing the admin team to ban users directly. The Habbo White House's experience illustrates the broader debate over using in-character systems to deal with out-of-character offences. In 2017, for example, a former statesperson in the game of nation-states delivered a lecture where they argued that role-play systems are fundamentally unsuited to dealing with real-life harms. Protecting the real-life safety of users was the paramount responsibility of all admins, they argued, and so anything short of total administrative supremacy, i.e. a dual state, would only hinder their ability to protect users, for example, instilling fear of political pushback for banning a very popular player. But not all users are receptive to this idea though. Some have argued that allowing admins to intervene in dealing with out-of-character offences runs contrary to the very philosophical idea of virtual democracy, that moderation should be governed, first and foremost, by its users. This escapist ideal, or fantasy depending on who you ask, can be so strong in certain parts of the community that some have argued that virtual democracies are not a form of roleplay at all. The other concern that some players have is that for a dual state to work properly, the correct administrators have to be selected, admins who are both benevolent and competent. But every incident of an admin maliciously abusing out-of-character powers for in-character benefit erodes public trust that such a person or body of people can even be found. When you have such a low-trust environment where players see admins as an equally sized threat to users' real-life safety and welfare, you inevitably create a situation where players will demand safeguards against administrative power, even if it means assuming all of the above risks. In those virtual democracies, the burden is placed on the players, many of whom being teenagers, to correctly balance constitutional rights with constitutional wrongs.
I think what everyone here wants to know is whether your party will commit to being more respectful in Parliament.
That much is clear. We will.
Alright.
When the Discord-based Voices of Democracy transitioned from a constitutional monarchy to a parliamentary republic, it marked the end of an era spanning over 3.5 years. The keys of ownership were handed over to VOD's second owner, President Knoll, in an orderly and peaceful transfer of power. In contrast, it took the Discord-based Republic of Crimea 6 weeks to transition to its second owner. The transfer of power was neither orderly nor peaceful. It was caused by the nuking of the Discord server and led to the First Crimean Civil War, where two competing servers, the self-styled Free Republic of Crimea and the First Republic of Crimea, vied to become the Republic's official successor. In fact, in roughly the same amount of time it took the Voices of Democracy to get its second owner, the Republic of Crimea, according to its agonizingly long official chronology maintained by state-affiliated historians, went through the following events. The First Republic, which was fully constituted after the end of the First Civil War, collapsed in the span of 12 weeks following a user-led revolution against the owner following several political crises. These crises included, among others, 1. The owner unilaterally voiding the results of a congressional election, 2. The appointment of a user who had been in the Discord server for less than an hour to the presidency, who proceeded to form the Crimean Nazi Party and become its first self-declared Nazi president. Yes, that implies there were more than one. And 3. The creation of internment camps to lock up server members who were citizens of another Discord democracy, the Republic of Discord. The Second Republic, which was founded by revolutionaries of the First Republic, was brought to an untimely end 7.5 months later after a triumvirate of admins, the President, the Vice President, and one other member, committed a coup d'etat and nuked the server. The Third Republic, which was founded by the Triumvirs after copying the contents of the old server to the new one they fully controlled, lasted for 1 day, after non-stop protests caused one of the Triumvirs to backstab the others to form a government of national unity with the protesters. The government of national unity ushered in the Fourth Republic, which was brought to an end 2.5 months later by the same Triumvir who ended the Second and Third Republics by committing another coup d'etat to form a new empire. The Fifth Republic, which was founded by the same revolutionaries who founded the Second Republic, was the very first one to have a peaceful transfer of power. 2 months after it was founded, it transitioned to the Sixth Republic after its owners supposedly transferred ownership of the server to an alt account they scrambled the password for. Reckoning that the very existence of owners was the cause of Cremeria's civil strife, its former owner boldly proclaimed the Sixth Republic to be the end of Cremeria's cycle of usurpation and political scheming, the end of history. The end of history ended 5 months later as the Sixth Republic balkanized into several breakaway states, including an Empire of Cremeria, 2 self-declared Seventh Republics, and the Eighth Republic. The Eighth Republic, which would eventually be recognized by all competing states as the Republic's legitimate successor, was brought to an end 5 months later by another coup d'etat, with an admin unilaterally declaring himself to be the Chancellor and Defender of Cremeria. The Ninth Republic, which was founded by opponents of the coup, was created after the rebels signed a treaty with the Republic of Discord to become its suzerain and guarantor of independence. It dutifully fulfilled those roles by immediately annexing Cremeria as its own territory before nuking it out of existence 13 days later. Twice, the Tenth Republic rose from the nuked ashes of the Ninth Republic after an entirely different set of triumvirs issued a de facto declaration of independence from the Republic of Discord. In response, the Republic of Discord, perceiving it to be an unlawful act of secession, set up internment camps to lock up their own members of the server who were citizens of Cremeria. Eventually, the Tenth Republic's independence would be recognised, and it would last for 40 days before it was nuked by one of its founding triumvirs. That led to the creation of the 11th Republic, which lasted for 11 months. As it entered into a period of managed decline, the owner of the 11th Republic secretly allowed the formerly deposed owner of the First Republic to run several alt accounts to create the illusion of a functioning government. Those alt accounts infiltrated all 3 branches of government, leading to a downward spiral of intense political turmoil and decline ended only by, you guessed it, another nuke. The 12th Republic, founded in opposition to the hijacking of the 11th Republic by the owner of the First Republic, lasted for 3 months, before its newly elected owner committed a coup d'etat and declared themselves Emperor of the new Cremerian Empire. The Cremerian Empire, which lasted for 39 days, saw admin permissions in the Discord server being passed around to multiple people. Eventually, admin permissions landed in the hands of Republican revolutionaries, who dissolved the empire to form the 13th Republic. The 13th Republic, which began with a triumphal declaration of the rebirth of the Republic, lasted for less than 2 hours after the former emperor, who still owned the server, snuffed out the rebellion by nuking the server. This brings us, finally, to the 14th Republic, which not only lasted for an unprecedentedly long year and 6 months, but ended with an orderly and peaceful transfer of power to the 15th Republic. The history of VOD and the Republic of Cremeria couldn't be any more different. In the same amount of time it took VOD to go through one peaceful transfer of power, the Republic of Cremeria went through coup d'etat, revolution, foreign conquest, Balkanisation, and managed decline, turning their never-ending cycle of political instability into a national mythos. To understand how virtual democracies die, and why some are more prone to dying than others, we first have to understand how they live in the first place. I would argue that there are 2 key elements that make up a virtual democracy: infrastructure and labour. Infrastructure refers to the platforms that host the virtual democracy in the first place. MPs need places to vote on legislation, judges need places to preside over trials, and civil servants need places to store troves of paperwork. In some cases, infrastructure can be set up at no cost. Subreddits and Discord servers are free to create, and Google Docs and Notion are free to use. But in other cases, infrastructure can cost real-life money. Minecraft servers have ongoing upkeep costs, and Habbo organizations can require thousands of dollars worth of capital investment. The value of the infrastructure held plays a vital role in political stability. If a virtual state's infrastructure and assets are worth thousands of dollars, revolution becomes an incredibly costly endeavour. Revolutionaries would have to find the money and expertise to create their own heavily modded Minecraft server or Habbo headquarters where everyone else can migrate to. In contrast, if a virtual state's infrastructure involves a Discord server and Google Docs, revolution becomes a piece of cake. Revolutionaries could simply create their own Discord server and copy relevant documents from the previous regime, like legislation, court documents, and executive decrees. This price tag of revolution is why certain forms of sim governments are much more prone to political instability than others. Labour, the other element, refers to the players participating in the virtual democracy. A government can only function if there are enough people to write its laws, people to enforce its laws, and people to adjudicate its disputes. The labour required also comes in many forms. While many players would probably have the skills to create basic campaign posters, not as many would have the skills to program custom-built election software or write complex court judgments. How virtual democracies can procure labour has been the subject of intense political debate. Many players have formed hypotheses on why players are motivated to participate in virtual democracies, which can help provide solutions on how they could attract new people. One of these hypotheses is that players participate simply because they're paid to do so. For virtual democracies based in MMOs, governments can pay their workers salaries using virtual currency. This hypothesis isn't very useful to virtual democracies without a currency though, like many nation-states, Discord, and Reddit democracies. Another hypothesis is that players participate in virtual democracies because of the activities available. For example, a Minecraft democracy allows players to save up virtual currency, set up private businesses, and then hire hitmen to reorient the market competition. Reddit democracies allow users to make posts, and that's pretty much it. The lack of activities for Discord and Reddit-based democracies in particular have led to some to kick the only source of their activity, day-to-day politics, to overdrive, like holding elections every single week, with the perpetual fear that their teenage player base will somehow lose interest. Relatedly, some argue that players participate because of political controversy. The theory goes that players live for the political drama. The more outrageous the political scandal, the more you can whip up angry players who will engage in forum discussions, lobby politicians, and launch lawsuits. For example, post-activity in the VOD Discord server shot up threefold in late December 2024 following backlash over the Prime Minister's handling of 1812, an unprecedented crisis for VOD involving many events, including but not limited to false flag attacks, mass deletion of messages, and the banning of a prominent opposition figure. The crisis posed an existential threat to the Prime Minister's party, the politically dominant SDP, which had previously been in power for 5 consecutive terms. What followed was a string of high-profile resignations, including by the Prime Minister, bitter party infighting during the subsequent leadership election, and the collapse of the government by one of its former coalition partners. The snap election that followed attracted the highest voter turnout in VOD's over 3.5-year history, as opposition parties sought to make the election a referendum on the embattled SDP itself. Galvanised voters delivered the anti-SDP coalition a landslide, which swept into power as a government of national unity with an unprecedented 13 out of 17 seats in the House of Representatives. 1812, however, also highlights one of the key criticisms of the theory's main assumption, that political controversy brings in productive labour. High voter turnouts and higher message counts indicate more activity in the Discord server, but they don't indicate more productivity. There's no guarantee that drama will bring in more judges, archivists, and software developers, and if anything, it arguably creates a toxic environment that drives people away in the long term, instead of attracting them. One final theory is the social facilitation theory, which posits that players participate in virtual democracies because their friends are in it too. The idea behind this theory, then, is that virtual democracies procure labour by attracting charismatic players with high social capital. You could essentially divide a democracy's population into these spheres of social influence, and winning these spheres over is the key to attracting and retaining labour. Regardless of the theories ascribed to, for a coup d'etat to succeed, both the infrastructure and labour of a pre-existing state needs to be taken over. For example, a coup is likely to succeed if it involves both the forcible seizure of hundreds of dollars worth of infrastructure with a view to depose an unpopular incumbent president. This is precisely what happened to the Habbo White House in March 2018, when 2 members of the admin team transferred hundreds of dollars worth of virtual assets to a new account that the president didn't have access to. The president was reportedly facing impeachment proceedings and 3 separate lawsuits at the time, and the coup was the final coup de grace that made him tender his resignation. Interestingly, one of the admins involved in the coup was a user by the name of Jess. Perhaps the coup of March 2018 was a foreshadowing of future events, because it wouldn't be the only time she would reportedly transfer hundreds of dollars worth of virtual assets to her own account, a claim which, it must be stated, she has previously denied. In contrast, nuking a Discord server without any popular support and then making players use the new one that you control is, quite frankly, an astonishingly terrible plan for a coup d'etat. While I would have concluded that only teenagers could have such a complete inability to do cost-benefit analysis in doing something as simple as a military takeover of government, apparently this inability is neither exclusive to teenagers nor the virtual world. When the president of SimDemocracy and his military advisors were debating how they should respond to Jackie's coup d'etat, they had no idea that their dilemma had been faced by thousands of other virtual democracies that had long preceded it. For them, it was a nail-biting crisis with no parallel, an unprecedented crossing of the Rubicon that determined the fate of the very idea of a virtual democracy. Without access to the extensive histories of the wider SimGov universe, the players of SimDemocracy would have to learn all of the lessons of the past on their own. Everything from cleaning up the statute books to busting transnational conspiracies to coup the elected government. Many of these lessons haven't even been covered in this video. For example, virtual democracies don't exist in a vacuum. They exist concurrently with other virtual states. There are treaties, diplomatic relations, UN-style bodies, international sanctions, foreign intelligence services, state-sponsored insurgencies, and war crime tribunals. Those missing topics, along with the individual topics covered in this video, are so extensive they can warrant separate videos in their own right. Without access to this knowledge, the president and his advisors had no idea about the lengths to which some people would go to cling onto virtual power. So as they debated amongst themselves in hushed tones, should they negotiate or should they form a government in exile, they had no idea that Jackie, who was indeed Gageboi from the very beginning, had been privy to their private conversations this whole time. I was joking about the cliffhanger, by the way. The story's ending isn't that exciting. The rebels briefly form a government in exile. Gageboi declares a state of emergency, he realises that no one cares, he gives up, hands over the subreddit to the rebels, and deletes his account. As one commenter put it, "So all of this ended with Gageboi just giving it up randomly? What a terrible ending, please rewrite." As for the military leaks, it turned out that one of the senators was secretly providing screenshots of the state's private communications to Gageboi, which was why he knew of their plans in advance. The way the senator was caught was kinda unbelievable. Gageboi, perhaps wanting to show off that he knew what the senators were up to, reportedly showed off one of those screenshots. That gave military intelligence enough information to work out the senator's time zone, operating system, and Discord settings. Enough information to also work out precisely who that senator was. Military intelligence then decided to set up a trap. Under the guise of a publicly available transparency report, one agent, Ghost, wrote that the senator responsible was caught and that they had now been turned into a double agent. The actual turncoat was completely blindsided by this and began privately messaging Ghost. Who was the spy, or who do you think was the spy? Oh sorry, I was driving home, that's classified. Do they know that you think they're the spy? They're a big asset now, it's very important not to let too many people know that. What if I told you... Maybe there were two. Fuck. Wait, are you the spy? Tell me who you think it is. Tell me. You. Everyone thinks it's you.